My name is Alexander Downs, and I am the chairman of the Dublin Civic Trust. And we're absolutely delighted to be co-hosting this event here today with the Irish Georgian Society. Thank you very much to Donna and to Emily and to all the Irish Georgian Society team for all their work in putting this together. I just want to say a couple of things, kind of off the cuff, but it has to do with what I actually do. And I kind of in my week I do three things. I own a company called Lamstone, and we work on glazed elements of historic buildings, such as those windows there. And at the moment we're working on Leinster House and the Four Courts and the Magazine Fort and College Green across the way. So that gives me this incredible perspective on the city, because I'm close up and personal with these remarkable buildings on a daily basis. But it also gives me a sense of what the city was and what it's not now. You know? One of my other jobs, well, it's not really a job, is to be chair of the Dublin Civic Trust. And the reason I do that is because it's a place of action. And what I mean by that is that over the last 30 years, the Dublin Civic Trust has returned 10 historic buildings to the city, because we do our work by revolving funds and demonstrating by action. And my third thing is I run a property portfolio on Talbot Street, which up to recently has been the absolute epicenter of, you know, where everyone is talking about the decline of Dublin and the problems of the north inner city. And over the last 10 years, 2015, 2020, we converted 4 above the shop houses back into houses. So, just to give you a brief, and I think the numbers speak something as well, because we were getting around 25 to 30,000 for the entire building in 2010, 2012. We then took the upstairs away from the commercial, and it was only being used for storage and boxes and that kind of stuff. And we made them back into houses in the shop, not flats, houses, 4-bed houses with a kitchen, the way they were. And we, instead of getting 25,000 for the building, we now get 25,000 for the shop and 40,000 for the house above. So if that's not an incentive to people who own these buildings to do that, and in terms of the practicality, and this is something I draw from the Dublin Civic Trust, because we're all about getting things done, showing how things can be done, because there's no problem with theoretical and it all has to be done, but actually getting things done is what's hard. And if I feel, and I'm sure somebody is working on this, and I kind of, you know, I also feel for a lot of the people who work in government departments and who are doing these jobs, who are hearing all this stuff again and again and again, and we're just wandering in here and giving our 2 tuppence bit and all that. And I feel for those people, because many of those people are working incredibly hard for our city. But I don't understand why there isn't a toolbox. You know, if I own one of these buildings, I just go and somebody says, here's a grant for that, and here's that, you don't have to do that, you don't have to do that, bing bang, gosh, we're done. Why isn't that there? Why isn't that there? These seem like practical things that are not happening. And that's what I would say today. Let's get some practicality into our city. Let's get some making things done. Okay, sorry about that. Our first speaker is Grania Shaffrey, who I don't really have to introduce because she's one of the most incredible conservation architects that we have in this city, and comes from a lineage of incredible conservation architects. So over to you, Grania.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. And just to thank the Irish Georgian Society, Dublin Civic Trust, Alexander for organising the conference and the invitation to participate. Let's see. The city which mistook its crisis for a plan was the missing title I provided for the artwork installation Scientia Civitatis, Missing Titles, an imaginary library of knowledge about cities which was realised by Vagabond Reviews, the late Alva Murphy and Kieran Smith, for the exhibition Phoenix Rising, Art in the Civic Imagination, held at the Hugh Lane in 2014, and which referenced Dublin's 1914 civic exhibition, which itself was inspired by the work of Scottish biologist, sociologist and planner Patrick Geddes. The Civic Exhibition attempted to reimagine Dublin as the phoenix of cities during a period of economic, social and political turmoil and a housing crisis. At the core of the Civic Exhibition's values were town planning, with a view to providing sufficient housing for Dublin's inner city poor and an emphasis on conservation and restoration as opposed to building anew. Brian Ward has written, the exhibition was organised with the intent of uniting the divided citizenry of Dublin around a sense of pride in their city and a sense of optimism about its prospects. I don't need to tell this audience, and many others have made this point, that we've effectively been in continual crisis mode since throughout the 20th century and into this one, be it housing nearly all the time, dereliction, decay, urban flight and urban blight. Perhaps this is too harsh, as over the course of time we have developed and implemented civic design plans such as post-1916 War of Independence and the Civil War rebuildings. This is really impressive at the urban scale and with individual buildings of distinction, following a three-dimensional civic design. And the speed of rebuilding was remarkable, and thanks to Willie Cumming for this slide. Also worth noting, this also included the decision to keep and restore buildings which might more easily have been removed for all kinds of reasons. Much later, 1986, I think, what started out as a Custom House docks development and then evolved into the much larger Dublin Docklands development master plans. And that's certainly worth review now. I think it's matured and settled well. And of course, the Temple Bar project, guided by the seminal Group 91 framework plan. We've also had initiatives or plans which have taken several attempts to be realised, and some are still at the gestation stage. The 1986 Metropolitan Streets Commission, established under a special act, developed plans for the O'Connell Street to Grafton Street civic spine. It proposed the renewal of O'Connell Street, tree planting, widening pavements and central median. This iteration was not carried through, but Dublin City Council itself did implement a similar scheme which has endured extremely well, as the photo here shows. Wide, high-quality stone pavements bound by the street buildings on one side and mature trees along the road edge create generous pedestrian rooms. We could do with more of these. And TII, when developing the Lewis network through O'Connell Street, carefully analysed the street's character and, critical for this type of transport infrastructure, conceived the Lewis as a public realm-focused intervention, not limited to meeting basic engineering and safety standards. The Metropolitan Streets Commission also developed proposals to create a pedestrianised plaza at College Green. It is taking several attempts, but hopefully it will soon be realised. And while not exactly a formal plan, I couldn't help adding the still compelling and incredibly accessible Gordon Cullen sketch proposal for the High Street Christchurch area, published in the influential 1974 Architectural Review. What these examples tell us, will tell me anyway, if the plan is worthwhile, don't give up. The importance of persistence and maintaining momentum. I think Alexander has said that as well at the outset. So my plea really is to not let our obsession with crisis get in the way of making and implementing good plans, and crucially, an ambition for quality. I'm more interested in the golden opportunities part of today's title rather than the crisis bit. If we develop our plans with a crisis mindset, we may absolve ourselves of the responsibility to do things well, and therefore thereby fail to grasp the opportunities. When we do build, be it individual buildings or public realm infrastructure, the likelihood is it's going to last a long time, much longer than anyone anticipates, even when we do the pop-up, the meanwhile, and the temporary. Therefore, we should set out to build carefully, responsibly, and with ambition for quality and beauty, with an aesthetic mindset. And here I use the folklorist and ethnologist Henry Glassey's definition. Aesthetics indicates intent and response. When an intention to give pleasure of a certain kind matches with an appropriate pleasurable response, aesthetic meaning has come to be. And once complete, we need to give value to caring, minding and using well. The Chicago artist Theaster Gates, a trained planner as well as ceramicist, who now makes art which is driven by using what already exists well, be it unused buildings, rundown urban areas, or under and unemployed construction workers. To a question as to how he had created an elegance and taste in projects which involved the mending of houses, he replied, "My knowledge of materials and my access to skilled people plus time created what you call taste. I believe that things in our lives should be cared for and they should be used at their highest level of use. So part of what you saw was my willingness to care for things and invest in the care of them." So with regard to buildings, and more particularly the vacant, underused, and in some cases derelict older buildings, and I do understand that there are many reasons behind this and causes, and it is traumatic, the dereliction on communities' psychology. I would love to be able to stand here and give easy and cheap and quick solutions. Turning them around is not quick. It's not simple, and it's probably not cheap in the short term. To quote Einstein, make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. For so many reasons all of you know well, social, environment, cultural, and with the recalibration of cost to build in embodied carbon and more holistic measures of cost benefit, we can't just continue to leave them fester and empty to go to waste. And increasingly policy is affirming this at the European level and indeed at home, and I think Nikki will probably speak much better to this than I can. The 2019 South Georgian Dublin Townhouse Reuse Guidance Document, bit of a mouthful, was prepared for Dublin City Council as a research and advocacy tool to set down practical advice with technical details and theoretical case study plan layouts for adapting this prevalent building typology for in the main multi-residential use. For the purpose of this talk, I offer this guidance as a form of civic plan. The information in the guidance relates to more than the strictly Georgian building typology, or indeed is it restricted to Dublin, let alone the South Georgian core. I'm not going to go into any detail on it, but I want to present briefly a few projects which informed it or have been guided by it. And just to say, one of the things that it recommended, and I think it's stated, and I'm not sure if it still exists, it's still happening in Dublin City Council, but that there would be a one-stop shop. So when dealing with these kind of projects, that you would be engaging with the planner, the conservation officer, the fire officer, accessibility, building control, together in an integrated way. And forgive me, I'm going to use some of our own projects. There are many others, but these were the ones to hand. So this project forms part of the recently completed ESB project Fitzwilliam. And the architectural strategy here was very, very much born out of the South Georgian guidance documents. It seeks the regeneration of residential communities by creating 11 generous new homes within 6 adjoining houses. Reactivating the front doors, which were formerly closed, it also seeks to engage and animate the surrounding area. And reconnecting with the square, it engages with a phenomenal additional amenity. It's critical for residential use in compact urban context that we make homes and places that we can live well in. And this is really, really important. It implicates the details. Here we developed bespoke details to meet acoustic requirements that were non-compliant with TGDE, which is the building guide for sound, and it required an application to building control for a derogation, which we got. So a non-standard detail developed to ensure that we put in appropriate sound protection measures, really important in apartment living, are met. Important point also, however, is this approval only applies to this project. It's non-transferable. I've said it before, we could do with the adaptive reuse of established compliant details which deviate from the TGDs. And in a way, the guide speaks to that as well. There were also innovations in improving energy performance, such as glass have been incorporated, and that also improves sound insulation, so the street noise is reduced. Again, focus on, if we're trying to make these convert into homes, we make them places where we would all like to live in. With regard to subdivision, we look to work with the plan and spatial form of the Georgian typology, meaning less units but generous homes, providing potential to accommodate a diversity of family unit and for long-term settlement. The importance of private open space and engaging with the inherited qualities of the buildings themselves, the fine proportions, elements such as the wonderful framed views, provide borrowed landscapes into the rooms within. This is 14 Clarendon Street, and here behind a simple street facade is a very rare and special interior. In this early 18th century house, original timber panelling survived as a full-height partition wall dividing the stairs and the rooms. To be allowed to retain and present this very beautiful and important timber wall required interrogating and interpreting fire regulations and fire safety solutions, as well as on-site negotiations with the fire officer. And Owen referred to the late lamented John McCarthy, fire expert. He worked with us on this. And, again, I suppose the pity is all of that work can't be transferred in another situation. It's the fire cert we have is unique to this building. It now contains one residential apartment over 2 floors, like Alexander, with basement storage and a small rear extension and roof garden, and a shop remains at ground level. And Henrietta Street, which is unusual in a way because it's a one-off project, but there are some lessons of relevance today. The museum came out of a plan, the 2005 Henrietta Street Conservation Plan, which led to a strategy, which led to a series of phased projects, which made the building structurally safe and weathered, which enabled a creative and memorable temporary use, which allowed public access and raised interest, which brought funding, which enabled the museum project. It had continual momentum, which was led by Dublin City Council with conviction and ambition. And when it finally became a construction contract, it was completed substantially on time and came in under the contract sum. Lucky perhaps, but I do think it's worth analysing these types of projects, and there are others. And I think persistence, momentum, a plan, an interested, committed client body which is empowered and resourced to get things done well. So I'm not talking here about architecture or the museum aspects, but primarily about delivering a project from plan to completion, about the doing bit. And here I just want to make a brief point about continuity of use. When people ask why can they have narrow, steep staircases in Amsterdam and we have to meet other regulations here? In the early 90s, we moved the office into the city centre. We took on an empty building of little value at the time because the plan for a very large bus interchange happening on Temple Bar was also subject to the north side of the river. And it meant anyone applying for planning would have been refused on the basis of this plan, which never happened, thankfully. Anyhow, importantly, planning wasn't needed or building control, as long as the use remained continuous. We did some essential works, but it continues in use as an apartment over an office. So continuity is critical, and we need to recognise, I think, and value this a little bit more. When preparing for the talk, I wondered, should the title not be "The City Which Mistook Its Crisis for a Vision?" As I wondered, where is the vision for Dublin? And I found it in the Dublin City Development Plan, which states, and I'll just read it here because it's a profound vision. Within the next 10 years, Dublin will have an established international reputation as one of Europe's most sustainable, dynamic and resourceful city regions. Dublin, through the shared vision of its citizens and civic leaders, will be a beautiful, compact city with a distinct character, a vibrant culture and a diverse, smart, green, innovation-based economy. It will be a socially inclusive city of urban neighbourhoods with excellent community and civic infrastructure based on the principles of the 15-minute city, all connected by an exemplary public transport, cycling and walking system, and interwoven with a high-quality, biodiverse green space network. In short, the vision is for a capital city where people will seek to live, work, experience, invest and socialise as a matter of choice. The preface for the vision states the city must collectively, through its citizens and civic leaders, develop a shared vision of what sort of city we aspire to, not only for the 6-year lifetime of a development plan, but for the next 25 to 30 years. It is only by developing a shared vision for Dublin that we can deliver the core strategies of each successive development plan as crucial stepping stones towards the long-term vision. Without a vision which enjoys broad support, short-term, often competing interests will prevail, ultimately to the detriment of the city. This is laudable and only proper, but it's challenging, and it's not fair to expect Dublin City Council to deliver on all of it. So my question really is, how do we do this, and how do we do it well? The way we develop the vision, the process, as well as what and how and what we implement are as important as the vision itself. And for me, it should be visualized and represented in 3 dimensions. It should be accessible. With current digital capacities, this is not a big ask, and I think David and Jim have given us a flavour of that as well, as indeed has Owen in his very clear and engaging images of the public realm proposals. So maybe it's there in increments, but it needs to come together. I'm nearly finished. 2025 happens to mark the 50th anniversary of 3 relevant and perhaps not insignificant events to today's conference. 1975 was European Year of Architectural Heritage, a year of many legacies, including, it can be said, our own legislation and policy on built heritage. 1975 also saw the founding of the Irish Planning Institute, and congratulations and very best wishes for the next 50 years. Town planning, the fundamentals of town and urban planning for the common good and envisioning the future are critical to a positive future of Dublin. 1975 also saw the publication of The Irish Town, An Approach to Survival. This book was concerned with all things urban, from village to city scale. I just want to quote one piece from A Policy for Conservation Part 1 on the public role. The underlying philosophy of urban conservation is that towns can undergo both social and economic expansion and physical change without losing their essential character. The success, therefore, of this policy is dependent on 2 important factors. Firstly, it must have the general backing of the public, and secondly, there should be a more positive and imaginative policy towards conservation adopted by local planning authorities. The general public have both the political strength and emotional persuasion to ensure that conservation policies are formulated and legislation improved where necessary. Local authorities have the necessary administrative powers to enforce such policies. This statement saw the role of both the public and the local planning authorities as shared, fundamental and powerful. So I make a final plea to take a holistic approach to the city, which can also allow for the neighbourhood scale to come through. Conceptual frameworks such as the historic urban landscapes approach might be very useful. From the very definition of a historic urban landscape as given in UNESCO's 2011 recommendations on the historic urban landscape, which I'm not going to quote now because it's quite a mouthful, but anybody who's interested, I have it with me. But it shows, it acknowledges the complexity, but the dynamic nature of cities and the contemporary and the past together, and the below ground and the above ground and the intangible and the economic. But it does urge an integrated, or maybe to use earlier term, not having, linked to silos, an integrated and inclusive ways of working. And it states here, urban heritage, including its tangible and intangible components, constitutes a key resource in enhancing the livability of urban areas and fosters economic development and social cohesion in a changing global environment. As the future of humanity hinges on the effective planning and management of resources, conservation has become a strategy to achieve a balance between urban growth and quality of life on a sustainable basis. And speaking of UNESCO, I will part with one other thought about raising the bar ambitiously for Dublin. And I have to say, I don't know where I sit on this, but I'll put it out and see. Should Dublin reconsider pursuing World Heritage designation? Having been on the tentative list in 2011, it chose not to apply in the more recent call in 2021. It certainly wouldn't be a dead cert that Dublin would meet the arduous criteria for outstanding universal value. But perhaps the journey, the explorations together, may in themselves bring worthwhile benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gloria. Our next speaker is Graham Hickey, and Graham is the CEO of Dublin Civic Trust. It's a walking encyclopedia of Dublin and historic Dublin, of its streets, and particularly of the North Georgian core, where everyone lives and walks and notices every single thing that's happening to every single building. So we could not do without Graham at Dublin Civic Trust, and we'd be fascinated by what he has to say. Just picking up there on what Ronja was saying, when I think about how do you get people behind the idea of something that's, how do you communicate the idea of a better city? How do you communicate that to people so people can actually put pressure on their politicians? You know, how does that happen? Because it seems to me that the majority of our politicians don't really care about this. You know, that we don't care about our historic cities or our states, you know. It's some kind of vestige of the belted earls and all that crap from the 60s. And so how do we put pressure ourselves? So that's something that I would love to see how we communicate that, even from this group, what comes out of today. So I'll shut up my line and let Graham take over. Thank you.
Brilliant. Might use this as a bit louder, I think. Thank you, Alexander, and good afternoon, everybody. It's appropriate on the first day of conclave that we're also scheming here in this octagonal classical room. When we think about Dublin's North Georgian core, I suppose a number of different messages pop into our minds. We have different visions about what it is. Probably most pointedly from a popular culture perspective, it's bedsit land in Georgian houses. To those of us more familiar, we're also very familiar with the beauty of the district and how it compares with the South Georgian core, particularly how its remarkable topography interacts with its terraced buildings and streetscapes. The area, I suppose, loosely expands from the North Circular Road up in the northeast down to what remains of Dominic Street, Henrietta Street, etc. in the southwest, arguably encompassing O'Connell Street going down to the Custom House. It also conjures up images of the conservation battles that were wrought in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s to save its Georgian streetscapes from the wrath of speculators, as well as from Dublin Corporation and slum clearances and road widening that took place at that time. We also think of the protagonists involved in those campaigns, the pioneers such as Marika Guinness, Desmond Guinness, John Malloy, who's here in the room today, the McGowans, Karen O'Flanagan, many others who quite literally stood in the way of the falling dominoes of Mountjoy Square and its surrounding streets to preserve the landscape that still stands there today. And we would be forgiven as a result for thinking that we have now reached some type of conservation endgame in a happy world of protected structures, of statutory architectural conservation areas, of guidance documents and noble development plan objectives that Gráinne has outlined. But this would be a facade. In fact, this is a facade retention, much like Stevenson Gibney's fairly forlorn-looking office facade overlooking St. Patrick's Cathedral. Because the reality of what is currently going on in Dublin's North Georgian core is an affront to our collective cultural heritage, to the community that lives there, and it is a totem to the hollow legal framework that governs protected structures and built heritage in Ireland, that assumes that the planning authority has even the will or the interest, never mind the resources and the expertise, to manage the built heritage under its care. I've written recently that the North Georgian core is floundering in a deleterious cycle of substandard accommodation and ever-accelerating unauthorised development in protected structures. The pattern is developed recently in a manner that is so extreme that it is imperiling the future survival of these buildings and the future sustainability of the area. Remembering that this is a large district in the centre of our capital city, not the black hole of inner city, that awful word that we continue to use. So I'll highlight some of the issues, starting with the market. I suppose in conferences like this we often focus on the built environment. That's what we do as built environment people. But of course the market that underpins what's actually going on in the North Georgian core speaks volumes about the physicality of what we're witnessing. Even defining the area is quite difficult. In my mind, it's loosely this kind of mushroom-shaped area. It takes about 2 minutes to walk from one side to the other in the lower section, maybe about 6 or 7 minutes to traverse it in the northern section. This is a CSO map that I computed using the CSO. I might just put that down. To generate some statistics about the North Georgian core. This tiny postage stamp of the centre of Dublin City has a population of 20,350 something people. That comes with 2 asterisks. Number 1, I should say, that is the size of Selbridge. It is the size of Sligo town. 2 asterisks. Number 1, how many people actually answer the door on census night? And number 2, how much has that population risen in just the last 3 years with the scale of the intensification of occupancy of the buildings in this area? I would say it's closer to 25, 26, 27,000, which is the size of Naas, without any of the administrative and municipal focus that a medium to large size Irish town enjoys. Looking at it from another angle, it's slightly different because of the metrics of CSO, but roughly the same in terms of ethnicity. 1/4 of the population in this area is Irish born, 3/4 are from outside the island of Ireland. If one extracts the social housing estates and the fringe of Summerhill that you see there, we're probably more like 90% of the population is non-Irish born. And consequently, the obvious issues that arise in terms of political constituency, in terms of a voice and having a decision over the investment that is made in that area, both private and public. Gardiner Street, as we know, of course, has become something of a poster child for the housing crisis. It was the first out of the traps about 10 years ago in terms of rising to the occasion of providing temporary accommodation in its old school guest houses and B&Bs. And the Irish Times, of course, has written extensively about Gardiner Street and its ownership in the past year or so. What is less understood is that what is happening on Gardiner Street over the past 5 or 6 years has literally moved like a tsunami to take over the entire North Georgian core. There is barely a street, a terrace, or a group of buildings in the North Georgian core that is not currently pressed into temporary accommodation, in large part provided by private providers to the state in its different forms, whether DRHE, whether IPAS, or whether approved housing bodies or other forms of temporary accommodation. But it gets a lot more extreme. The most recent figures provided by Dublin City Council is that 80% of the homeless accommodation in Ireland is located in the DRHE region, in the 4 Dublin local authorities, 82% of which is based in Dublin City. In other words, 2/3 of our nation's homeless accommodation is based in Dublin City. Annual homeless accommodation spend is to hit €300 million in Dublin this year. The state is therefore probably the largest single current investor in Dublin city centre, spending €200 million. The North Georgian core is therefore, based on the number of known beds in the area, is probably incurring a spend of at least €100 million. The North East Inner City Department of the Taoiseach-sponsored initiative, its budget is 7.5% of that figure. And as anybody who lives in the area knows, pretty much all of that figure is spent, as the locals call it, SOS, south of Summerhill. It doesn't come near the North Georgian core, save some of the greening strategy and events that are held in Mountjoy Square. In total, about 53 million has been spent since the NEIC initiative was launched in 2016. In the same time period, somewhere in the region of €500 million of public funds has been spent, understandably, in terms of meeting the needs of the homeless crisis, but that has been spent in Dublin City in the same time frame. In effect, the state is giving high-profile crumbs in the form of the NEIC, and with the other hand, it is pulling the rug, the joists, and the foundations of the entire district out with the other. Given the scale of what's actually happening in the North Georgian core, particularly in terms of how the private sector is rising to the occasion of adapting their buildings without planning permission, without recourse to building regulations or recourse to conservation, on a huge scale, that one seriously needs to question, is it in fact the Irish state is the biggest vulture preying on the North Georgian core? And I say that with huge regret. The second part of the issue is that the private sector, of course, is following suit. The very idea that these signs can still exist pre-63 in an era of planning regulations and housing standards and the Housing Act of 2015 says everything. To most people or most investors looking at these signs, this is what it really means. It's a planning-free zone. You can do whatever you want in the North Georgian core, and the state will pay you handsomely to do it. This might seem like a prurient photograph. In fact, this is about 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a winter's evening. This is what is currently happening with the few high-quality urban homes that ever existed in the North Georgian core. This is a building converted in the 1990s into a decent one-bedroom apartment. We're actually not looking into the bedroom, we're looking into the former living room. This is where the newly acquired investor landlord has decanted the apartment of furniture, filled it with single beds. The mezzanine home office has been converted to a double bed where an Indian couple share. And the sole surviving one-bedroom apartment, one bedroom at the back, has been chopped in two, with a bunk bed on one side and a bedroom on the other. There's 8 bed berths in what is ostensibly a one-bedroom apartment. This is happening at an accelerating rate with the few surviving high-quality homes in the North Georgian core. The second issue, of course, is planning enforcement, which we're all familiar with and my hobby horse, and it comes with the question mark because, quite simply, it's non-existent. And anybody who lives and works in the North Georgian core or in Dublin city centre generally, this is pretty much a fortnightly occurrence of finding the innards of Georgian buildings in skips while they undergo major alteration to create substandard accommodation. Evening views are usually much more revealing, to see Napoleonic type interiors being carved up 1970s style with stud new ceilings, etc., through the new unauthorized PVC windows. The brazenness with which works are being carried out. This is a major 3-bay Georgian house of the scale of one finds on Merrion Square, being chopped up into tinderbox type conditions. It is now stated Dublin City Council policy not to pursue the insertion of any type of window in a protected structure that does not involve the removal of the original historic fabric. They will not pursue replacement windows of the first generation replacement windows. You can put whatever you want and they won't do anything about it. This is the types of horrors that you pass pretty much on a weekly basis in the North Georgian core. One can actually stand on the street as the Munster Joinery truck arrives. One can stand and actually ring the Planning Enforcement Office, and it can take 3 weeks, 3 months, 6 months for somebody to even come to site. I can't show you the much more extreme gutting of early Georgian buildings next to the Department of Education, the gutting of Georgian houses literally outside the Minister's office, outside the Custom House, or in the most extreme cases, the wrecking of Georgian facades on Parnell Square, literally overlooking the Garden of Remembrance, where foreign heads of state and cavalcades pull up outside the wrecked remains of Georgian facades. It is a case of national embarrassment. The third problem, and I suppose to counter Gráinne's thing, I'm focusing on the crisis rather than the golden opportunity. It's worth noting that this is the standard of a good quality, medium-sized hotel that one would expect to be designed and built in a highly sensitive receiving environment off a Georgian square in a capital city. This was parsed and analysed by high-quality conservation consultants, by high-quality architects or planning consultants, to deliver something of this beautiful materiality off a Georgian square on the south side. This is what a medium-sized hotel looks like on a Georgian square facing the internationally significant Rotunda Hospital on the north side of Dublin, where the fibre cement cladding can actually be pulled off with your fingernails. I have sat at a boardroom table with major international investors, and they referenced this. They could not believe that something of this standard was facilitated in the centre of a European capital city. They were aghast. I was mortal. The extra top-up stories were granted by An Bord Pleanála at the peak of its dysfunction. I need not mention the array of telecommunications junk that is consuming Dublin city centre. This is the high-quality public building that one expects in a Georgian environment on the south side of Dublin, a magnificent award-winning new public school on Harcourt Terrace. On the south side of Dublin, this is what a major new facility public building looks like on the north side of Dublin, on probably the most benighted streetscape in the country on Summer Hill. This is not an RUC surveillance point. This is the primary care centre for the whole North City Centre, paid for with public funds. This is the quality that one expects of an intervention in a Georgian square, the beautiful multi-million euro new Dublin City Council tea rooms that are about to open in the middle of Merrion Square. And this is what the north side gets, the de facto replacement of the Rotunda Hospital in this underhand extension, kind of masquerading as a critical care wing, when it is in effect a replacement of the Rotunda Hospital, actually building out Parnell Square, turning a Georgian square into a street with no policy guidance around it. And the planning authority is falling over itself to grant permission for this development. And just as a final point, and this is actually what interests me more in a way, this is the fine grain. This is what we want to encourage, what David was talking about earlier, this kind of fine grain intervention into the existing urban environment, high quality muse scale apartment buildings to be built on muse lanes, as this case on Mountjoy Square. The planner insisted on the high quality materials, on the plot divisions of the building, and a bit of kind of sexy detailing in the brickwork, and including brick gables down the side of the building. And yet this is the structure that actually gets built. It gets handed over to an approved housing body. They engineer out all of the elements that the planner insisted on in additional information, and planning enforcement don't want to know about it. So to Gráinne's point, where is the vision for Dublin's North Georgian core? Where is, as Valerie was mentioning, that wonderful term, the general agreement for what we want for Dublin's North City Centre? Paul Kearns will recognise this slide. Paul presented this at a conference that we ran about 7 years ago, focusing on, as Gráinne was mentioning, the future for the South Georgian core. And rightly, that question was being asked, how do we value that magnificent, internationally significant Georgian streetscape? But forgive me for asking the question about the North Georgian core and asking what are our values and what do we expect to be delivered for the landscape north of the river. Because if what we're currently doing is our collective vision and the Irish state's vision for successful urbanism, then I would suggest that the South Georgian core remains firmly in established office use. There is green shoots. The Capital City report, the task force report appointed by the Department of the Taoiseach, at least highlights a number of these issues. It also highlights the stakeholders that need to grapple with, as Donna mentioned at the start of this conference, the bewildering array of issues that urban management raises. But this report, like the Mulvey report before it, it misfires. It doesn't want to deal with the unsexy issues about properly resourcing the planning authority and the local authority to do the job that it is tasked to do. On planning enforcement alone, I've been informed just in the past few days that Dublin City Council's planning enforcement has now reduced to 5 people. There's nobody left at the tiller. Development control, compliances, all need huge resourcing in order to deliver the vision that so many of the speakers here today have been talking about. And the state is currently proposing to spend hundreds of millions of euros on reviving what is ostensibly an office block, the GPO, as a distraction to the issues that the North Side faces, while staring us in the face as the revival and as the igniter for the revival of the whole north side of Dublin, the Rotunda complex, its spectacular 18th century assembly rooms, its pioneering maternity services, the Gate Theatre and the former pleasure gardens have the potential to literally reignite and reshape the image of the north side in our collective public imagination. And the state doesn't even see that it's there. So in conclusion, there is lots of positive things happening in the North Georgian core. The plans for Mountjoy Square are finally about to come on stream. The Dublin City Library that Owen referenced earlier, the Poetry Ireland facade, that scaffolding has just been dropping in the past few days. It is such a tonic to see something of that quality and that beauty on the north side of the city. It actually stands out like a sore thumb because it's the only decent building in the area. But it gives a flavour of how beautiful the north side could actually be. So I'm really going to leave it with this tantalising provision that Dublin Civic Trust got included in the programme for government. We're quite proud. We think this is probably the first time the word Georgian has ever featured in a programme for government. And it is to effectively revive the North Georgian core through conservation-led investment in its streetscapes. So what we need now is the vision and the strategy to deliver that in the context of what's currently going on in that much benighted but much beautiful part of our city centre. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Before we get beaten up, there is also another beautiful building across the square from that one. On the 30-mile square, which was done for teachers by DNBF, and was really the windows too, so I have to put that in there. Because we're actually, the Dublin Civic Trust is doing a walk-around tour of it in a couple of weeks' time, facilitated by the IMTO. And what, you know, Graham is right, these two buildings are now, and even the fact that they've got dark windows, Lucy, they just, you know, so it is about that action, it is about having little beacons of hope. you know, on streets, taking streets street by street. It's granular, as he said. And it's not, well, this is incredibly important, all of the, and I've never really been struck so much by, especially David's and Jim's work on Galway, just when you always squint your eyes and look at the maps, you can see so much more stuff, and also in Niall's incredible maps of Dublin. You learn so much by sometimes taking a huge overview, but then you really need to get granular on the street. Our next speaker doesn't need any introduction either, really. When I first started in Windows, she was the conservation officer, scared the hell out of us. But she's now gone upstairs to Customs House, and so we're dealing with many other great colleagues. But Nicky Matthews, who was conservation officer, acting conservation, I can never know who's acting and who's doing, but she was conservation officer of Dublin City Council until about 5 years ago, Nicky. And then she went to the Customs.
A bit longer.
Oh, did you want to use these?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alexander. It's a great privilege to be able to talk today, and my thanks to the Irish Georgian Society and Dublin Civic Trust. I'm following on from two very deep thinking, well presented presentations, and I'm going to talk about something, I suppose, a bit more alternative, reflecting the role that I do currently of national contact point for the new European Bauhaus. I suggested that in this presentation I would like to reframe the Georgian legacy of Dublin, and to do that I must first visit material that I presented in the Mary Bryan Memorial Lecture, namely how Georgian Dublin has been appreciated over time, what is its statement of significance, and what has been achieved to date in terms of the policy and practice which manages and seeks its future development. And then, having considered existing approaches, I'm going to pose, is this a time to adopt new practices, working methods, and to address persisting issues of vacancy and dereliction, housing, climate change action, and looking at new opportunities that Europe are bringing to our door. This is this wonderful image from 1854 by James Mahoney, with thanks to Graham for lending it to me. And it gives a wonderful image of the Georgian city at that time. J. Warburton and colleagues in 1818 describes Mountjoy Square as, on its completion, as neat, simple and elegant, its situation elevated and healthy, the elevation of the houses, the breadth of the streets, so harmonious together as to give pleasure to the eye of the spectator, and add to the neatness, simplicity and regularity everywhere visible, entitling this square to rank among the finest in Europe. Merrion Square is described as a noble square, environed on three sides by lofty houses, which have been built in the modern style. And then in recent times, this city was, as Grania alluded to, submitted to the World Heritage Tentative List in 2010. And I think to read the statement of significance at that time is important. The development of Georgian Dublin was a significant moment in the history of the Age of Enlightenment, with the establishment of the Wide Street Commissioners and the founding of many charitable and public institutions in buildings of high architectural quality. The Wide Street Commissioners, Europe's first official town planning authority, established to make wide and convenient streets through the congested quarters of the city. Their remit, vision and interventions to improve in the city in a world where such functions were usually the preserve of royalty by the rational application of aesthetic principles were exceptional and were later copied in other cities. Sorry, I have to do a few things here at one time. Of course, this is the Jonathan Barker map previously alluded to, which is part of the Pembroke Estate Papers, setting out the layout for Merrion Square and the neighbourhood. And I suppose the idea that, restricted leases and guidance about materials and building standards were part of the original vision for Marion Square. It also points to, this is one of the first town planning maps in Europe. I also wanted to allude to the craftsmanship that is contained within the buildings, the setting for our great writers and artists and critical thinkers. This is described very well by Christine Casey and Conor Lucy in their decorative plasterwork in Ireland and Europe, as sumptuous plasterwork ornament is a celebrated and distinctive feature of Ireland's 18th century domestic architecture and brought to us by migrant craftsmen from Europe. I also want to reflect on the amount of research that was prompted by the return of the Pembroke Estate papers to Dublin in 1995 and the valuable resource that it brings to the understanding the city. And critical voices from these publications. Ronnie Scott was recorded in Redrawing Dublin by Paul Kearns as saying that Dublin, as elegant and logical, is beautifully done. And of course, turning to Niall McCullough's 18th century townhouse, published in 2011, the conclusion is perhaps the most persuasive fact is that the Georgian city itself, the streets of houses, yards and courts, forming and woven interlocking entity, is the major monument of Dublin, which has always stuck with me very forcibly. In the collaboration on the Georgian Squares of Dublin, led by Dublin City architects, Lachlan Keeley reminds us of the legacy of this fabric and how we might think about planning its future. Of course, we now have the interim survey complete for Dublin and published, and the Georgian city sits within these documents. And how this translates is in the blue dots, which I have superimposed on the first ordnance survey map of Dublin. What's interesting to me about this is that it does describe the loss that Valerie spoke of earlier, the missing pieces that have happened over time, that have been replaced with contemporary structures, but that there is still a coherence to the North City and to the South City of the South Georgian core. And when one looks at the current city development plan, how this translates really speaks to that point that Jim made earlier, and David Brown made earlier, about 2D planning. What does this actually, how is this actually creating the vision of the Georgian city, its remaking and its ongoing future development? And what I found fascinating was that in terms of moving away from just individual buildings, the North Georgian core has 3 architectural conservation areas and a 4th one planned for Parnell Square, where the South Georgian city quarter has 1 architectural conservation area pertaining to the Georgian character area. And it really is the irony of what Graham has spoken about. The difference in treatment is quite striking. So this part of my presentation is about things that happened in the last years that I think made, I suppose, a big difference. They were the game changers. Actually, I should have also said at this point, sorry for being so nervous, is that, reading the current city development plan, I note the really progressive policies that are now in place for built heritage and the widening of the vision for built heritage as part of promoting environmental benefits, contributing to sustainability, economic, cultural, social and environmental principles, the promotion of best practice in fabric repair and restoration, adaptation, resilience in line with the National Climate Change Sectoral Adaptation Plan for built and archaeological heritage, and policies that support high quality architecture with respect to cultural identity and past traditions of settlement. So these are all, sorry, I'm not watching my screen, these are all really progressive steps. But I suppose a lot of research has informed different stages, and I recognise that defining Dublin's historic core was a profoundly change in how we looked at the city in terms of the surviving infrastructure of the Georgian city and how it still was there if we were to look for it, and how our public realm policy could hang off this. The three-dimensional form of the city needs to be understood. And as Neil McCullough said, you can still see some of the chimneys all the way down, an absolutely beautiful thing, and lines of terraces that went back for miles. And the historic core really sort of reflected that. It went on then to look at the tourism potential of Merrion Square. And this was a very interesting project, and why I include it here is that it sort of showed innovation in terms of community engagement, this time with businesses in the areas like hotels, the cultural institutions, and sort of making Merrion Square more accessible. It did yield very positive results. It was a European exemplar. Grania spoke about the tea rooms, Graham spoke about the tea rooms in Merrion Square, and this was all envisaged as part of this innovation. Other innovations were of a more small scale, like the OPW taking on the lead of restoring a Muse House as part of the antiquaries site, and the importance of returning a historic garden to Merrion Square, and the full building plot and the hierarchy of scale being realised and understood. Similarly, the remaking of broken spaces or areas that had been tar-macadammed as part of the high quality amenity of living in a Georgian house in Merrion Square. But in 2008, 2010, Dublin was sort of lurching under the financial crash, and it was very obvious that there were buildings in the city that were vacant. And I suppose I always found this image really interesting. It sort of demonstrates the complexity of the problem, the range of typologies, the scale of them, and I suppose condition, which is something that we don't really map to date very successfully. Grania spoke about her project on the South Georgian core and the results that it yielded in terms of giving examples of dealing with regulation, subdivision, and future uses for Georgian buildings. And prompted by this work, we attempted to collect case studies that showed what the potential of these properties could be. And this is a range of different properties: a very large-scale house on Merrion Square, a smaller one on Northumberland Road, and then living over the shop. And speaking to that point about, the regulation, the sorting out of the fire is all particular to these buildings, and yet we have a range of buildings that show great quality and great housing. And then, of course, the institutions came along, and they sort of offered us suggestions about how we might remake sites and how we might work with the Georgian typology. And I'm very struck standing here today that so many of the projects that I've selected here are very much the work of Grania and her office, as indeed is this one that she presented. And I suppose the learning that the Conservation Office in Dublin City did over time, which continues today, is about understanding its building fabric and solutions that it throws up. I was surprised when I saw this image the first time, and I'm sort of surprised again seeing it now, because it sort of tells me that I've got older too. A lot of these players are retired, but it does give me the opportunity of introducing the idea of, okay, we've done all this before, we have wonderful examples of projects and guidance or whatever, but it's still not giving us the solution or the vision for the city, and what do we need to do next. And I suppose in the words of Ursula von der Leyen, we need to, leave the path that we've been on and maybe explore other opportunities of how to work to address our current problems of housing, climate change, etc. And as David and Jim pointed out, our cities are really, should be the focus of how we operate for the future. So this is Ursula von der Leyen's project. It introduced the Green Deal, and I suppose it's a very much a European project. It was introduced as to encourage a cultural shift towards creating a sustainable continent of Europe by 2050. And I suppose it's about a long-term vision, and it's about cooperation, and it works around these ideas of beauty, sustainability and inclusion, leaving nobody behind. It supports the implementation of the first European architectural policy, which was in turn underpinned by the work that came out of the Cultural Heritage Year 2018 in Europe, the ICOMOS European Quality Principles, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Bauhaus Baukultur. And I suppose I'll point out to you in the slide the ideas of quality and what they might look like: context, sense of place, beauty, environment, diversity, governance and functionality. And these are the things that the new European Bauhaus is interested in. Europe has very much, I suppose, put a focus on cultural heritage, like the Dublin City Development Plan. The focus is moving to the adaptation and reuse of existing buildings and places, the need for retrofitting to address climate change, resilience. And I very much like this idea from the European architectural policy about the idea of this ongoing culture of architecture, a continuum of quality, of dealing with our special places and bringing them on into the future. And on the top right of this slide is an example from the European architectural policy. And of course, we have the new HQ for ESB and all the qualities that are embedded in that, the craftsmanship, the environmental energy efficiency, the remaking of a place, and of course the Georgian Mile and the view towards the mountains. So what does a NEB future, or a new European Bauhaus future, look like? Well, it's about engaging people at grassroots levels. It's about providing tools and guidance, offering tailor-made solutions for different communities, incorporating the views of various stakeholders in the process of design and implementation, prioritising people, social inclusion, but also having an eye to the economy to boost competitiveness. This is a range of projects that have been worked through the new European Bauhaus values and principles. And I suppose what was very apparent from this policy introduced is that it had a very much a focus on co-designing with stakeholders and devising ways of bringing people along with you to solve a problem. In recent times, it has moved from, I suppose, just a policy to a more structured approach, and now funding has been provided for research and innovation, which is very much engaging our colleges and designers. And I draw your attention to the focus on circular economy and regenerative approaches, new business models, and interest in terms of looking at regulation and in funding models. And then the piece that I've been looking after up until now is the rollout component, where funding is being offered to get research into practice. And I think this is an interesting idea of that we make use of research that we have. So we have research like what Graham has done on the North Georgian core. You know, what can that information inform, and how can it change things? So this is the new roadmap for the new European Bauhaus facility, which is the research agenda for the programme. And this is what it looks like at the moment across Europe in terms of projects that are happening. And I suppose what I'm trying to suggest to you is that Ireland is not alone in these problems, but there are also other countries dealing with similar. The opportunity to partnership up on research programs and to learn from other situations is part of this way of working. And these are on this are mapped the projects that have come through the European Bauhaus Festival as awarded projects, and lighthouse demonstrator projects, etc. So you can click on this map and find out more about these projects and perhaps become involved in them. What was really striking about the new European Bauhaus from the get-go was that this was very much a designed and co-created process. And it spent time in identifying what were the problems that had to be addressed, but it also has spent time in developing key tools for people to work with. So the compass is the guiding framework, how the beautiful, sustainable together works. The investment guidelines is looking at the whole process of funding and how we get a high quality built environment established. And then the toolbox is a set of case studies and tools that people can draw inspiration from. This is the self-assessment tool, which is one of the more recent developments. And I suppose it has a specific piece on the idea of how do you identify beauty and whether or not you have achieved it. So for instance, quality of design and delivery, improving building resilience, ensuring occupant health, comfort and well-being, improving accessibility of the built environment for everyone. We've touched on many of these subjects already this morning. Understanding aesthetic perceptions of buildings and spaces through comparison to actual styles and tendencies in art and architecture. So this is the purpose of this document, is that when you undertake a new European Bauhaus project, that you can evaluate how you've done on the various aspects. Have you done well on the beauty? Have you done well on the sustainability? Have you done well on the social inclusion? The good news is that the new European Bauhaus is already in action in Ireland. Under EORDF Thrive project, a programme that was launched in 2022, every local authority in the country is now working with the new European Bauhaus. And I suppose its initial feedback from this is that local authorities really welcome it as a way of working, in that it has started to address some of the deficiencies that have prevented the implementation of good practices, allowed better engagement with projects, etc. So I suppose it's very interesting that Europe see Ireland as being almost the sandbox of the testing for this way of working. They have come to Ireland and provided training using the tools that I've just described. And I think many of the local authorities have gone away very much encouraged and inspired by working in a different way on problems. Problem solving, everybody at the table, identifying the key stakeholders who should be part of the problem solving. So at the moment, we have 5 projects identified or allocated funding under Strand 1, which is capital works, and that we will be starting a further assessment of other projects recently submitted. But this gives you an idea of funding going to heritage, and heritage being part of not just providing repair of a heritage building, but a project that talks about sustainability, environmental consequences, social inclusion, and doing the heavy lift of bringing a community along on a journey in terms of, rebuilding, revitalising their neighbourhood through heritage. So as I say, these projects don't just look at heritage, but they look at sustainability, life cycle thinking, quality design, climate proofing, and the principles of do no significant harm. And what's important about the Thrive funding programme is that it embodies these quality principles as part of the funding outcome. And Alexander, you'll be very encouraged to know that windows and the repair seem to be part of circular economy and something that maybe will address, the deficiencies or the losses that we have in towns and cities. So what would this process look like? Well, here's an example from a European peer learning experience. This is how working in a different way will create a much more integrated approach, multidisciplinary, the importance of good governance to achieve high quality architecture in the built environment, development of new local and regional partnerships, fostering inclusion in the built environment, participatory governance, transitioning towards sustainable ways, applying circular economy, mitigation, and climate change action. And then ultimately, by working this way, we create attractive places, regeneration, new uses for buildings and spaces. This is the new European Bauhaus, the values and the principles, beauty, sustainability, inclusion. How do we achieve them? Through participation, multi-level engagement, transdisciplinary approaches. And the themes that very much, reflect even how Galway was looking at its future, reconnecting with nature, regaining a sense of belonging, prioritising the places and people that need it the most, the need for long-term life cycle thinking in the industrial ecosystem. So what would this look like, say, for the North Georgian city? I mean, this is a project that Irish Society with Dublin Civic Trust have been exploring and hope will future deliver, but it is about greening and making beautiful the streetscapes, the enhancement of the central park. If I look at other cities, what are they doing? They're looking at Limerick here has a programme running with the IAF about reimagining the future of buildings, so an engagement project. But Limerick also is interesting in terms of how it is very much engaged with the digital platforms and 3D twinning model made of the city, as well as these ongoing engagement programs through their Fab Lab. And I suppose it's interesting how they are building a momentum and a capacity with a local community about this is their future and what they need to do or how they need to be on the journey together. This is their digital model where you can go in and you can actually see what way your building performs currently and how you might actually upgrade your Georgian building. What's really interesting to me is that not only is transport, roads, but energy is now part of the infrastructure for a historic city, and how we are going to offset that need to sustain not just the fabric, but also them as a warm, comfortable, contemporary place to live. So this is images of their Fab Lab and their ongoing I suppose, design of outreach to the communities and working with communities. They map, cycle routes and everything, so that it's not just looking at heritage in a narrow lens, but looking at it as a part of a future for the city. And, in recent times, research has continued in terms of the fabric of buildings and how they be formed. And what if we actually start to try and use digital means to start to really tell people how this all comes together. The traditional skills are hugely important to the new European Bauhaus, and the need for revitalising them as part of the repair and maintenance addressing climate change in historic buildings. And of course the wonderful exemplar at 18 Norman Quay is really a wonderful project to visit. So in conclusion, there's an awful lot of information on the new European Bauhaus. It takes a bit of time and reading to become familiar with, but there really is some inspirational projects, and the one here on the left is, I think, of interest to everybody in the room. It's about tackling place-based transformation. Started in 2024, it's now into another phase of research, and models will be coming from that, so that's available online. Its purpose is to empower policymakers, I'll just get it right, innovation for place-based transformation to empower policy practitioners in building capacities, designing and implementing transformative approaches. So really this is how Europe is working. It's trying to train up local authorities, public services to sort of take the lead in terms of building a new future. So there's a lot of resource material in that. And then of course the new European Bauhaus goes to Osaka, the world exploring architecture and urban planning, and that'll be available online as well. And I suppose just in conclusion, the vision for the future, the European built environment and the architecture of tomorrow should be of high quality and benefit everyone. And I think the new European Bauhaus brings us on that journey and allows, as demonstrated by the ERDF funding, the importance of embedding quality into funding programs. This includes ongoing management, adaptation and reuse and reimagining of existing places, with a particular focus on existing places. The quality of our historic places are of vital importance to the recovery of Europe, as quality in architecture and our built environment contributes fundamentally to social cohesion and sustainability and well-being. European multidisciplinary and participatory governance approaches with innovative engagement foster social inclusion, support democratic decision-making and sustainable development of neighbourhoods and cities. And this is a big focus of future funding for the new European Bauhaus. The reframing of the Georgian legacy of Dublin as part of this is integral to reimagining its future of the city's fabric. My last slide, you'll be happy to hear, is just to remind you that this week the Venice Biennale will open, and the Cotter Nasons project assembly will be revealed. This Irish installation will return in 2026 and will hopefully contribute to the overall experience of the Irish presidency, which will take place in 2026. It can be imagined as a venue to continue the discussion of issues of civic space, community engagement, and the role of architecture in shaping democratic environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vicky, and thank you to Graham, and thank you to Anya. We'll now have 10 minutes of question.
It's just a query more is externally and internally. Externally, I'm passionate, or even the Irish Georgian Society, not object to those monstrosities that Graham showed on his slides there, And internally, the architectural staff within the City Council themselves not raise question marks or applications should be granted. Even with going as far as contacting the architects for the development, inviting them into City Hall for a cup of coffee, and discussing it with them. Surely we can do better than this.
What I'd say is that Antashka probably did submit, certainly on Arnold Square, I would imagine, and Kevin Duff is one of the unsung heroes in Dublin City in terms of advancing quality with proposals of that kind in sensitive historic environments. I think that's a very good point. I think Dublin is probably one of the few capital cities internationally where major development proposals are not assessed from an architectural and design perspective. It goes to the Roads and Transportation Department, it goes to the Conservation section, it goes to the Water and Drainage. Proposals, even from major civic design interventions in the city, do not get reference to city architects. And I would suggest that that should be a material change in the running of the city, is that there is an architectural input on major, and in fact any significant proposal in Dublin city centre should have some architectural oversight from within the local authority. And also I'd say that in defence of planners, because planning has become so immensely complex and bewildering in terms of national policy, regional policy, sustainability, guidance, we can't all have those skill sets. Planners need to have that design input, and that should be supplied in-house by the local authority.
James Pike. I want to raise one thing that really has emerged, and it's about funding of our local authorities. We have quite a ridiculous situation here, where only 9% of all taxes raised in the country go to the local authorities. The average across the OECD is over 40%. And there are many like Denmark which are higher, even in the 60%. So we do need to do that. That is one of the most urgent things. It's no wonder we've heard a lot about the inability of the City Council to follow up and any other local authority. Thank you.
Siobhan Amy, thank you very much to all of you for your presentations. But I'm speaking just really in a sense because of Graham's, which struck me very deeply. And I'd like you to bear witness, if you like, to the fact that what he's saying is absolutely true. Absolutely true. I'm 70 years old, but I know the inner city of Dublin from being 4.5, 5, going to school in Marlborough Street, then in Eckley Street. I did art classes in Dawson Street, music in Chatsborough, and the point is, from very early childhood, I knew and loved the inner city of Dublin. And for me, travelling either side of the river, it felt like one organism, one kind of entity. But I know over the 65 years between that time and now, the imbalance, the serious imbalance between both sides of the city, north and south, is huge. It's gaping, and it's really wrong. It's really, really wrong. I think it's interesting to note that, if you like, our national institutions such as our Dáil and our Shannon, they're all south of the river. The major cultural institutions, arguably, are south of the river. If you like, I think we have 18 government departments, and all bar 3, if I'm not wrong, are officed or housed, if you like, south of the river. So, if you like, power, money, and I think it's not insignificant that the Georgian core document by Dublin City Council was for the South Georgian core. There is a North Georgian core, which is actually older, arguably, in fact, more significant. There's Parnell Square, which Graham has mentioned. There's Mountjoy Square. I worked many years on Mountjoy Square. I know this area of the city very well, and I know what he is saying is absolutely true. The lack of respect, the complete imbalance either side of the city, by the powers that be, I'll just use that term. And and then property values and what's expected, the two examples Graham gave about the hotels. You know that is there all the time. There are far more trees, the pavement, there is just such a yawning gap between both sides of the city. In a city I love, my father loved, I have known from when I was very small, and it's getting worse, and it's just not right. And ultimately, our city won't survive this into the future. It won't, nor should it. There needs to be a respect for the entity that is the city, the organism that is the city, and that's both sides of this river that goes to the sea, that connects us to the world. I love Dublin, but I know that the yawning gap of respect between both sides is a serious problem, and it's not getting better, not in my lifetime, so far. Now, I'll live and hope, but something needs to change, and it is a government thing too. As I've said, just in the simple things about where offices are. Everything kind of migrates south. South is, yeah, that's what we show on the posters. Okay, thank you.
Willie Cumming. Maybe to follow on and just take a slightly different perspective from Siobhan. I mean, I agree completely with what she's saying. I also agree with Graham in relation to the North Georgian core. But I do think from out of this discussion, it's important that we don't just focus on the Georgian core, whether it's north or south. The city is bigger than the Georgian area. I understand architecturally its significance, etc., but it's a bigger city. And when I was given the task of preparing the statement for Dublin as a potential World Heritage City, I was very careful not to use the Georgian city. So I talked about the historic city. And the historic city is medieval, Georgian, Victorian, and modern. And that presents a problem. But and I understand why probably it was taken off the tentative list. But it is a wider thing. I live probably 2 streets from the North Georgian core. And what I think is interesting in terms of the form of Dublin is how it drops from 4-storey over basement to 1 2-storey houses. I live in one of the 1-storey houses. And interestingly, it's exactly the same form as Bordeaux. When you go to Bordeaux, you go through the 18th century, early 19th century, and you're into 1 and 2-storey houses in exactly that kind of same way. But the problems that are affecting the North Georgian core are also the same problems in those other areas. And on my street, there was a house sold in the last couple of days, which was advertised as having 8 bedrooms. Now, how the hell did I manage to get 8 bedrooms in? And it's sold for about 900,000 on a street of single-storey and 2-storey houses. Now, something is going on there. And in fact, what's happening is all the houses have been bought as Airbnbs and been developed as Airbnbs. So the problems of the city are not just a Georgian problem, it's a problem, a general problem. And I think if we are putting together a statement at the end of this, I think it needs to be able to recognise that wider thing as well.
Roisin Handley, architect. There has been quite a little bit of negativity and maybe well justified, but I'd like to focus on some of the very positive things. I think Nicky Matthews is correct what she's saying, this is a unique fund that has just become available to actually focus in on what people are trying to do, and I would hate that to be actually lost, because this is the first time I've seen something like that, and I think that's really, really important. And Gordon, you make some other very positive suggestions about getting a toolbox together, about picking out really positive examples, and they can be done. And as an architect, I see Kieran here is back from Europe, and when he was head of the student group, he helped to save Eccles Street, and we did all of that, and we did 22 projects on the street that saved that street. And sometimes it's just a simple thing, like the windows, incredibly important, but it's also showing people how it can be done. And I just like to finish this session to say that I think Nicky Matthews' speech on how the funding is going to be done should not be lost, because it's actually a game changer.